welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. Few leaders in the world polarize opinions more than Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. He is hailed by supporters as a champion of Venezuela's poor communities. But he is also denounced by critics as a dictator. What does the future hold for Chavez and his revolution? To discuss Venezuela's present and future, I'm joined by Thor Halvorssen in New York. He is the founder of the Human Rights Foundation. In Caracas, we go to Eva Golinger. She's a Venezuelan-American attorney and best-selling author. And in Washington, we cross to Daniel Hellinger. He is a professor of political science at Webster University. And another member of our CrossTalk team, Yela Nahanga. All right, folks, CrossTalk rules in effect. There's a lot of differing opinions on this subject, and I'd like to first go to Eva in Caracas. In the wake of the parliamentary elections, Western media gleefully is predicting the demise of what they call the dictator Chavez. What is your take on the election result, and what do you think is going to happen as we move towards the 2012 presidential election?
Well, I mean, there's really no question that the victory here was definitely for the pro-Chavez United Socialist Party of Venezuela, the PSUV. I mean, they won 60% of the National Assembly, the legislature. At the same time, I think we could call it a bittersweet victory, because certainly the opposition did regain some of the space that they did used to have in the legislative body. But it's not a sufficient block to really try to put a brake on the Chavez government's policies. So, I mean, the international media is trying to portray it as some kind of defeat against Chavez or blow to his presidency, but it's really not. And it reaffirmed, I imagine, a political party that's only been in existence for 3 years, got 98 seats out of 165 in the legislative body. So it's definitely a clear victory, and the Chavez bloc will be able to continue to implement the same policies as they have been over the past several years.
Okay, Thor, you wanted to jump in there already. Go right ahead.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's important to note that Eva Golinger may be an author, but she works for the Venezuelan government. Her salary is paid for with funds from the Venezuelan government. So I think it's very important that the viewers of this program actually know that.
Okay, well,
so let's start off with that.
Thor,
the reality is...
Thor, if I could jump in here, right now, okay? I don't want someone impeaching somebody's character on the panel, okay? I asked you, Thor, well, how do you respond to that interpretation?
I'm stating a fact.
It's not a fact that is germane to the question. So what do you think of the election outcome? What do you think the election outcome means?
Of Venezuela.
What do you think of the election outcome?
The election outcome is very simple.
Go ahead.
52%.
Thor, go ahead.
52% of the votes were cast for opposition candidates. And the reality is, if 52% were cast for the opposition, that is not a victory for Chavez. It's only a victory for Chavez with those that get paid to spin for Chavez. See, I don't work for the Chavez government. I don't work for any other government. That's the difference.
Okay, if I could go to you, Daniel. I mean, there's a lot of criticism of the United States around the world of sending enormous amounts of money to get the election outcome they want in Venezuela. I'm thinking of maybe NED and other American organizations. I mean, has that had any impact? Because it seems like they want to get a certain outcome, and it's very visible. It's very easy to find this information. It's all publicly known. Is the United States happy? Make my question real short about the election outcome. You think?
Okay, well, to take the second part, probably on the whole, the U.S. probably is happy with the results. I'm sure they would have hoped the opposition would have gotten a majority. In reality, there's about a small segment of the vote that it went to a political party that cannot be characterized either as opposition or pro-government. You subtract that from the 52% that Thor was referring to, and in fact, it was a narrow popular vote victory for the PSUV, but a narrow one. And I do think that in some ways that's a setback, because I think the Chavez would have liked to have gotten a much more solid majority and would have liked to have seen the PSUV, his political party, have delivered a more solid block of votes in favor of of what he wants to do. In terms of the outcome, in terms of the number of seats, it's a victory for the PSUV.
Thor, you wanted to jump in there? Go ahead.
So, Daniel, Daniel, in the minds of the other two guests, votes for parties that are not with Chavez are votes for Chavez. That's absurd. And with regard to your comment about United States funds going to Venezuela, the truth of the matter, and your viewers should know this, is that the government of Venezuela uses state funds. State funds are used to fund the party of Chavez, yet state funds are not used to fund any other party. That is not democracy. You have David and Goliath situation. And besides this, you have to remember besides this, that you have in Venezuela the shutdown of media that opposes the government. You have harassment of anyone, persecution, expropriation. Okay. If you stand against the Chavez government, you get persecuted.
Okay,
that's
so I think we got your point. We got your point. Eva, go right ahead.
That's not true.
Go ahead, Eva.
Can I?
Yeah,
I'd like to jump in here. Well, foreign funding, and there is certainly millions and millions of U.S. taxpayer dollars are funding political organizations, parties, and campaigns here. There is clear and direct funding to the opposition campaign from U.S. agencies and other international agencies, and it's a violation of the law. I mean, you could say that maybe the government invested some funds into their own party for this campaign, but that does not justify opposition groups receiving foreign funding in violation of the law, and of course, U.S. agencies violating Venezuela's sovereignty.
There is a cult of personality going on in Venezuela.
Certainly, excuse me.
It's my turn.
I want Daniel to jump in here. We have three members on the panel. Daniel goes now. Go ahead, Daniel.
I haven't finished what I was saying.
All right, I apologize, Eva. You can finish your point, and then we go to Daniel. Go ahead.
Finish what I was saying.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to finish. There are no media outlets here shut down at all. I live in Caracas. I watch the television. I watch all the different stations. You even get Fox News here. So, I mean, certainly there's an ample variety and diversity of opinion that's available. There is no persecution.
This is propaganda.
There's no persecution of any point of view. There were two prisoners, actually.
Absolutely untrue.
Excuse me. There were two prisoners.
Absolutely untrue.
That ran. There were several prisoners actually that ran.
The owners of Golinger have been exiled.
Two prisoners won. That's not true. Two prisoners actually won the elections in certain districts, and they ran on the opposition ticket. And now they're trying to claim immunity because now they're members of Venezuela's parliament. So, I mean, we're talking about, I mean, what country in the world allows for prisoners to be put on a legislative ballot and then to win the election and then be released from prison because now they're getting some kind of a parliamentary immunity?
All right, Daniel, Daniel, you can jump in there. Daniel, you wanted to jump in earlier. Daniel, go ahead. Jump in.
Yeah, I'd like to do that. If Thor would stop yelling in my ear, I'd probably be able to do that. Essentially, what I would argue is that if, first of all, Eva Golinger has done a good job of documenting the flow of money. It's somewhere between $35–40 million. You don't have to rely necessarily. You can go to the sources that she cites to say, yeah, Thor, you said that before. Just let me finish. Will you please?
I would like Daniel to continue.
I mean,
let's let Daniel continue his point. Daniel.
It's not the truth.
Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, well, anyway, if you want to sort of check up on her, read her book, go to the sources, and go to the, and you'll see the amount of funding that's gone from National Endowment of Democracy, Office of Transition Assistance. So I think she's right when she points to the amount of money that the United States has funneled into what are primarily opposition organizations. Now, I'll also say that in many ways, campaigning in Venezuela, the media is highly polarized. Listeners and viewers can check for themselves if they go to the various sites of the Venezuelan media. I think they'll see that there's a very vigorous debate, and that there's a tremendous amount of opposition. The opposition virtually has most of the private media. The state government uses the Chavez government uses the state television network to get its point of view across. There's a pretty vigorous and lively debate that goes on in Venezuela. Now, so it's kind of an exaggeration, to say the least, to say that everybody who's got an opposition viewpoint in Venezuela is persecuted.
Go ahead, Thor. Jump in.
Okay, let's begin with the fact that the person that's coming in from Venezuela, Eva Golinger, states that media is free in Venezuela. Is that the reason why Channel 2, which included Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, governments around the world, the European Parliament, all of them saying, please don't shut this down, Mr. Chavez, because you're critical, they shut it down. Globovisión, the only remaining private channel that is critical of the government, the only one remaining, both of the owners have been exiled. They've both been persecuted in what is, it is an injustice that anyone who looks into it can see the truth. The truth is that Hugo Chavez does not permit dissent. He does not permit dissent, which is why people who disagree with him end up in jail. There have been people jailed for comments they've made on television shows just like this one. If you make a comment that Mr. Chavez and his government does not like, they will go after you. They are pursuing what they have called on the record communicational hegemony. That's what they want, because they know that if they communicate and they control the airwaves beyond what Chavez does daily, when he grabs them for 6, 7, or even 8 hours a day.
Okay,
Ms. Golinger says, no, I want to finish.
Okay,
I
make
would
it
like
quick,
to
please.
finish.
Go ahead,
I would
make
like
it
to
quick.
finish.
Make your point.
If Ava says, oh, you even get Fox News here, this is extraordinary manipulation. She has satellite television, she has cable, because she has the money of the Venezuelan government. She works for them. She does not disclose where her sources come from. Her newspaper is entirely
Okay, Thor, we're running out of time. I want Eva to be able to respond before we go to the break. Eva, respond before we go to the break. Go ahead.
Go for it.
Go for it.
Yes. First of all, everyone who takes that radical extreme position against the Chavez government claims that anyone who has a different position receives funding from the Chavez government.
I'm for free speech. I'm not against Chavez. I'm for free speech.
I am not excuse me. I am not a paid agent of the Venezuelan government. I am an independent attorney from New York City who's been doing an investigative research for years on U.S. intervention. I pay my bills with my clients and the work that I do and my books and my writing.
Who pays for your newspaper?
Excuse me.
Who pays for your newspaper?
In any case,
after a short, folks, after a short break, we will continue our discussion on Venezuela's pacto. Stay with RT.
England and France try to reason with Hitler. Germany demands Sudetenland and gets its way. They all thought they had created a safety net for themselves. 1939. The whole of Europe is engulfed in war. Efforts to establish a system of collective security in 1938 failed, and it's still on the agenda today. The lessons to be learned from the Munich Agreement on RT.
Welcome back to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing Venezuela's political battles. But before, let's see what Russians think about the Venezuelan president.
President of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, suffers his worst setback at the ballot box since taking office in 1999. His United Socialist Party lost the two-thirds majority needed to push through legislation without consulting the opposition. However, it was still a performance that any party would have been proud of, given they've been in power for 12 years. The Public Opinion Foundation asked Russians what impression they have of Hugo Chavez. Russians who have seen his media appearances are almost 5 times more likely to be positively impressed. The major question today for Chavez is the 2012 presidential election, as recent results show that many of his supporters did not cast their votes. Peter?
Okay, Eva, I'd like to go to you and maybe slightly change the subject here. Why, in your opinion, and you go back and forth between Venezuela and the United States, what is the obsession the United States has with Chavez? Okay, I mean, what threat does Mr. Chavez pose to the United States? It's not its military, obviously, but it certainly has a lot of oil. Is that it?
I mean, there are really three major issues. One, of course, is oil. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves of any country in the world in one country. Obviously, the U.S. has immense energy consumption needs, so having oil in the hands or being controlled under the government of someone like Hugo Chavez is not convenient to U.S. interests. The other issue is that, typically here over the 20th century, most of the governments were aligned with U.S. interests and with multinationals. All of that has changed under the Chavez government. This is a government that's focusing more on national development and national investment and regional investment as well, and integration, and then looking for ways to go beyond the U.S. as its only major trading partner and reaching out to countries like Russia and China and Iran and a whole other diversity now of different nations that have these relations with Venezuela. And then, of course, I mean, there is the ideological factor, although it can't be considered the number one factor in terms of the U.S. viewing Venezuela as a threat. But certainly when you have, in the 21st century, someone who's talking about socialism after, the U.S. spent the entire 20th century trying to wipe out anything that smelled of socialism or communism, and here it is again, right south of the U.S. border, and in this country with all this oil and with this individual who has this, immense influence over this region. I mean, the U.S. does see it as a threat, and so they're trying to make all these links with Venezuela to terrorism and drug trafficking and calling it a failed state in an attempt to justify this aggression and this constant funding of movements to undermine Venezuela's democracy.
Okay. All right, Daniel, if I can go to you real quick, and then we'll go to Thor. I mean, in researching this program, I came across the fact that the French state is more socialized as far as people working for the government and GDP than Venezuela is, but we constantly hear this diatribe against it. This is, socialism, this is Marxist-Leninism, and the number of times when I looked at Google this morning, the Marxist dictator of Venezuela, I mean, it's not very Marxist in a broader scheme of things, is it?
Well, I mean, Hugo Chavez has pronounced himself in favor of what he calls socialism of the 21st century. Now, that's rather vague and hard to define, but remember, again, this is an oil country. The economy, the most important factor in the economy is the state oil company and the revenues that are generated by oil. It costs about $12 a barrel to produce oil in Venezuela. So when the price of oil now is about $70. So even with it being low compared to a few years ago, it's a lot of money coming into the state government. So then there's a question of how that's to get allocated, whether it's allocated democratically, how much popular influence there is. So when we're talking about socialism in Venezuela, in my view, socialism is about exactly, who controls the super profits that come from oil exports, whether they're going to be used for human benefit, whether they're going to be where they're going to be invested, whether or not the corruption can be cleaned up, or whether or not some people are getting too wealthy. So I mean, that's kind of the and I can tell you that I heard that about 60% of Venezuelans basically say they're in agreement with socialism, and about half of them are in agreement with Chavez and this idea of socialism of the 21st century. But the other half of that 60%, so about 30% of Venezuelans, have a kind of vaguer notion of socialism, in which basically be closer to something like social democracy in Europe.
Okay. Thor, if I can go to you. I mean, the United States constantly, and listen, Western media, and you even get from high government officials, depending on the administration, using the words like dictator or strongman, or certainly a disparaging term for the Venezuelan president. But on the other hand, the United States has lots of friends in the world that really, truly are dictators. But they're not demonized in Western media. As a matter of fact, they're just not talked about because they're allies of the United States. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, responding, Eva Golinger brought up the word communism with regard to talking about Hugo Chavez. And I think your viewers will well remember 80 years of communism and what they did for Russia. And they will remember what actually it meant in terms of political prisons, in terms of the standard of living. Venezuela ranks very, very low on Transparency International, 162 out of 180 with regard to corruption. 12 years of Chavez give us levels of corruption the same as the Congo and the same of Angola. Venezuela. If you look at inflation in Venezuela, inflation is highest in Venezuela than in any other nation in this hemisphere, in the Americas. So that should give you an idea with regard to the allocation of the money. Now, for all the bluster about Chavez versus the United States, the truth remains that the #1 client of Hugo Chavez with regard to oil is the United States. And what they do with the money, most of it goes to Chavez's brothers, his family, and the cronies in his government. So that's something to remember, and very important to remember. The levels of corruption in Venezuela are stratospheric. Why the United... I'm sorry, I let you finish, Eva. Now you're going to let me finish. There were a lot of things that you said that were not true. I let you finish. With regard to Hugo Chavez and why the United States and Europe, I may add, has a problem with him is because Hugo Chavez has undeniably been financing the FARC terrorist organization in Colombia, an organization that, according to the European Union, it is considered a terrorist organization. So much so that Chavez himself has had a minute of silence for the death of the FARC leaders. Venezuelan weaponry ends up in FARC hands. The Swedish government actually had a problem with Venezuela and made this very public when Venezuelan missiles, Venezuela was sold missiles by Sweden, by Saab, and those ended up in the hands of the terrorists. So that gives you an idea of why the United States has a problem with Hugo Chavez. With regard to your comment, Peter, about, I'm sorry, with regard to your comment, Peter,
can I jump in here?
with regard to your comment about Chavez being a dictator, and I'm sorry, Eva, I let you finish, Eva, and I gave you a really long time.
It's not take too much time. Let's keep it, apportion it fairly. Go ahead. You want to make one more point, Thor? Go ahead.
The three of you seem to have, Peter, I just said go ahead. Consensus about Chavez. The three of you have a very strong one, so I'd like to finish. Okay.
One more point.
Hugo Chavez is undeniably a man who acts like a strong man. He is an electoral dictator. That means he allows elections. Meanwhile, he puts a stranglehold on freedom of speech, puts in prisons those who disagree with him. And with regard to the next election, the #1 candidate that has outpolled him over and over again, Leopoldo Lopez, a former mayor, actually is disqualified, along with 400 other people, from running for the next election. So one has to put that into context and think, does he act like a dictator? If you look at how he refers to the media, how he refers to those who oppose him as snakes, as worms,
Thor, you've said this before. You said it earlier in the program. So Eva, go ahead, because we're running out of time.
It's important to say it again because all three of you are on the other side.
Go ahead. I mean,
Thor, would you please let someone else have a word in edgewise?
Go ahead, Eva. Go ahead. Please go.
I know.
I'm not allowed to talk, but you guys are.
It's unfortunate that you've given so much space to such an individual who really has absolutely zero credibility. And nevertheless, I think it's important to point out that many of the those allegations made by the person just speaking are based on nothing factual whatsoever. Hence the personal attacks constantly.
An Interpol report?
We're listening to Eva. We're listening to Eva right now. We are all listening to Eva at this moment in time. Go ahead.
Yes. The allegations in general against Chavez in terms of him being a dictator and that there's some kind of situation going on here in the country that merits or could be considered as a threat is used as a justification. I mean, again, I think we have to go back to the base of the matter here, which is the oil. I mean, there's really no question about it. And then, of course, I mean, Hugo Chavez as a person has a very strong personality, and that comes across in international media as being a strong man. But I can tell you, as someone who's lived here on and off for over 17 years, this is one of the most thriving democracies I've ever seen. The level of participation, and it was proven in these last elections where over 67% of voters came out to participate in legislative elections, which was a historic amount of voter participation in Venezuela.
And they voted against Chavez.
Also around the world.
And they voted against Chavez.
These past several years,
Daniel, I'd like to go. We haven't had a lot from Daniel here. I'd like to ask Daniel about the nature of democracy in Venezuela. Okay.
Latin America is changing. Latin America is changing.
Go ahead.
To some extent, Hugo Chavez is an outspoken person against this kind of wave of neoliberalism, pro-market democracy, I'll put that in quotes almost, around the world. And that's one reason that the United States doesn't like him. But, we can put too much emphasis on Hugo Chavez. Latin America is changing itself. Countries are trading with different parts of the world. The Latin Americans are forming their own security organizations apart from the United States. Hugo Chavez is as much a product of these kinds of changes as he is as a leader of those kinds of changes. Now, in regard to things like the FARC, I was down in Venezuela a few months ago. I talked to opposition figures. I talked to opposition newspaper. I talked to people like Teodoro Petkov. Most people don't really believe in Venezuela, even in the opposition, I think, that the government is directly funding the FARC.
Now, it's a very about this. Interpol
has issued reports on this.
No, your viewers are being misled, Peter. Yeah. This is total. No, your viewers are being misled. Interpol.
Well, anyway,
all right, folks. We've come to the end of the program. We have come to the end of the program. I knew this was going to be a polarized debate. Many thanks to my guests today in New York, Caracas, and in Washington, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.